All right, cool. Okay, so yes, as I was saying, so this is work that was actually done in collaboration with Eimaan Saqib, Junghyun Choy, Shijing He, Ruba Abu-Salma, José Such, and Mobin Javed, as I said, mostly theirs. So smart home devices don't just affect the privacy of the owners or privacy or primary users who choose to install them, but also secondary users living in the home and others whose data they collect. And there's a growing body of academic literature about smart home privacy, mostly about privacy of primary users, but also increasingly focused on other users and bystanders. This literature often makes recommendations for product design to improve bystander privacy, but many of those recommendations have never been implemented or tested, and there's a big gap between research findings and industry practice. So this talk is based on a systematic review that we, by which I mostly meant my co-authors, conducted of research literature on smart home bystander privacy. And our goals there were to identify common themes in bystander privacy concerns, the threat models behind them, along with factors affecting variation in concerns and perspectives, to synthesize the many design recommendations that we found, map those recommendations to the identified privacy concerns, and identify gaps. And I haven't tried to cram citations for all 48 references into my slides, but we're submitting a paper to ACM-CHI later this week, so fingers crossed, the information will be all out there in one place. So first, a quick detour to explain what we mean by bystanders in this context. So a bystander, of course, is not a type of person, but it's a role that a person plays relative to any given device or system. So literature categorizes people affected by smart home devices into the owners or primary users who have the most control over the device, secondary users in the same household, incidental users who have occasional interaction with the device, and non-users who have no control over the device, but their data may nonetheless be collected. And any of those roles may also be targets of monitoring or surveillance by other users, though that is more likely with those who have less control of the device. And different studies have defined the term bystanders differently. So for the purposes of our lit review, we just basically took the broadest definition, basically anybody who isn't a primary user. And bystanders can also be considered in terms of their relationship to the smart home or the relationship to the device owner. So studies will often target specific types of relationships. So that might be visiting bystanders, such as guests and family members, domestic workers, tenants in short-term rentals like Airbnb, delivery people or other strangers, or it could be live-in bystanders within the home, family members, spouses or roommates, children, long-term tenants, certain domestic workers. Literature has also looked at issues for victims of intimate partner violence or domestic abuse. And these different types of relationships tend to have different power dynamics with different implications for control over what happens in the home. So before I talk about the design recommendations, I'll talk about some of the concerns that they're intended to address, though I don't have time to cover the mapping from concerns to designs that I mentioned before. So in a review, we divided up the concerns by threat actor, but I'll also mention that some of these concerns are more relevant to particular devices, and some are more generalized, and some are more relevant to particular bystander roles, while again, some are kind of go across different roles. So by far, the main source of concern for potential privacy threats seems to be related to primary device users, including undisclosed devices, either purposefully hidden or just not mentioned. Bystanders' lack of control of their own data, since they have no opportunity for consent. They don't tend to have their own accounts and profiles, and it can be socially difficult for them to ask primary users about privacy settings or negotiate changes to how they use their devices. They're also concerned about misuse of data by the primary users, including spying or surveillance, harassment by primary users, or discrimination. And they're concerned about owners tampering with use indicators that show when a device is collecting data. Other sources of privacy concerns include manufacturers, in particular just uncertainty about the data practices, including due to confusing interfaces and use indicators on the devices, and concerns about improper data handling. Another big concern is data sharing or selling, or use for other purposes that the bystander isn't comfortable with, that they don't have the ability to control or to refuse consent for. And there's also external threats, such as hacking, which may be exacerbated if primary users don't have the knowledge to secure the device properly. And of course, these concerns aren't universal across bystander groups or situations. There's a lot of contextual variation in how worried people are about a particular issue based on their relationship with the owner or primary user, including how well they know them, level of trust, any imbalance of power or authority, whether they use the device at all, their past experiences with smart devices or past privacy problems, cultural context, what the privacy laws are in their locale or what they think the privacy laws are, and design factors, which I will get to. So in deciding how to deal with bystander privacy, smart home product teams, of course, also have to consider the needs and purposes of the person who's actually going to hopefully choose to purchase the device. And there are often trade-offs between privacy for bystanders and functionality for the device owner. In the most extreme cases there are when the owner's primary purpose for the device is to monitor or surveil someone. But even then, there's some parameters that can be limited by the device without impinging on that, and in many cases, designing for bystander privacy wouldn't affect the primary function at all. In addition to the simple fact of who owns the device, there can also be other power imbalances between the owner and bystander. So bystanders may have to concede their privacy more than device owners tend to concede functionality. And unfortunately, it can be difficult to generalize about how trade-offs should be dealt with, as they're very dependent on the particular context and the particular purpose of use. And different groups of bystanders may have different privacy needs. So now I'll move on to the whirlwind tour of common themes and design proposals and potential issues for implementation. And I'm going to focus on recommendations for product design, but I'll note that many papers also give recommendations for policy and public education, as well as for separate tools like independent of the smart home products. And again, some of these designs are specific to certain types of devices and others are more generally applicable. So the first set of recommendations that I will talk about aim to improve how devices convey their data practices. So for example, researchers have proposed ways that devices could share information about data practices and usage status directly with the bystanders, not relying on the user via smart home dashboards or apps. For instance, a Bluetooth low energy beacon could transmit information about device status that could be viewed on an app by someone logged into the home Wi-Fi. A potential app could also compare the data practices with the user's preferences and potentially even facilitate a negotiation using a digital agent. Examples of status beacons and dashboards have been prototyped, but to my admittedly limited knowledge, have not been implemented commercially. And some potential challenges for these designs include compatibility between dashboards or apps and the devices from a bunch of different manufacturers, potential security vulnerabilities from broadcasting device information, and the risk that they could be used to avoid monitoring by the owner if that's the purpose of the device. Which, not great, but that's what some people want to do. So researchers have also recommended prominent non-tamperable indicators showing whether the device is collecting data or on standby, such as LED indicators with consistent symbols, easily verifiable ways to turn off sensors, such as a lens lid or a shutter for a camera. And status indicators are pretty widely used in commercial products, but they tend to be pretty basic and they are often confusing. And not many products have verifiable cues that sensors are shut off. Challenges include, again, that making indicators more complex doesn't necessarily help the confusion, so they need to be consistent across products. Another recommendation is to have physical privacy and security labels explaining some data practices that are high priority both for owners and bystanders, such as a sticker on a device saying that what's been sent off device or what's retained with a QR code for more details. And some efforts to develop standards for labels are underway, but they aren't in wide use yet. I think that was mentioned in Slack in an earlier talk. Potential challenges include consistency and clarity, as well as accuracy, especially since the physical labels can fall out of date, and also accessibility. The next group of recommendations focus on minimizing data collection and storage. Some recommendations involve involve limiting recording or streaming from smart home devices to doing it under certain conditions, or on the other hand, setting it to discard or obscure data under certain conditions, either time-based or set by the user or triggered automatically, for example, by motion or facial recognition. So for instance, a smart speaker could be set to not save a command to history if it's from an unrecognized voice. And a few companies have implemented guest modes like that in their products. Some have time-based constraints, although fewer than you'd think. And some automatic triggers have been implemented, but to the best of my knowledge, it's still pretty limited. Challenges include accuracy of recognition for automatic triggers, especially for safety features like recognizing if you're trying to recognize the noises of a break-in, where you really don't want a false negative. And as always, it might conflict if it's a device that the owner wants to use for monitoring. Devices could also collect only those data types or only granularity of data type that's necessary for their primary function, including least privilege sensing, be set to automatically discard data once the purpose has been fulfilled. So for example, a smart camera in a short-term rental where the host wanted to make sure the guests weren't having parties could record decibel levels but not record full audio. And these choices about data collection and storage are certainly possible with current technology, and in some cases they have been implemented, generally for the sake of the primary user's privacy, which they also protect. However, defining necessary to function is already a hard problem with primary users, especially given the common impulse to design products that collect as much data as possible. And then the goal gets even more complicated when you are considering bystanders, since what seems unnecessary to a bystander might seem necessary to the primary user. And then for data retention, there's also the problem of what to do about data that's been saved off device. Next, smart home interfaces could incorporate nudges, encouraging primary users to consider others' privacy. And so, for example, a camera's setup wizard could suggest that the primary user should adjust the field of view to avoid capturing data through the neighbor's windows. And such designs have been prototyped, but to my knowledge, they are not yet commercially implemented. And more user studies are needed to judge how effective such nudges would actually be and how to minimize their intrusiveness in the setup process. The last set of design recommendations aims to provide bystanders with some measure of control over their own data. So devices could be designed to allow multiple profiles with fine-grained privacy configurations that the owner can use to give bystanders limited access privileges. However, for those not inclined to fiddle with privacy settings, there should also be some preset profile types like guest profiles, child, domestic worker, Airbnb guest, with default limited privileges and that also limit data retention. So for example, a smart baby monitor could have a nanny mode where a nanny can access the live feed during certain hours if they're in the house. Multiple profile structures, including like preset child profiles, are possible with current technology, but they're not as widely implemented as you would think. More fine-grained profiles and profile types have been prototyped, but not much implemented commercially to my knowledge. Those designs require robust authentication for different profiles, and any usability friction there could present a challenge for adoption, as opposed to just sticking with the all-or-nothing model. Recommendations have also suggested obtaining bystanders' permission before collecting or saving data about them, if you really want to get strict, or allowing device owners to access it. So for example, a camera could require permission authenticated using facial recognition before they allow another user to access data with that face in it. And early versions of those type of permission systems have been implemented commercially, but it's still pretty rare. They can be tricky to implement structurally. They depend on accurate recognition. And in addition, a device that's limiting its owner's ability to see others' data may be the least likely to be chosen by an owner in a situation where those protections are most needed, for example, when devices are being used to spy or harass. Finally, there's recommendations for tangible physical controls that can be used by bystanders or anybody present. For example, a set of switches that could be used to shut off sensors on any smart device in a home. Simple physical controls like mute buttons are currently possible and sometimes implemented, although there is a tendency for smart home designers to prefer providing screen interfaces or apps instead of buttons, too old-fashioned. More complicated widgets have been prototyped, but to my knowledge, not implemented. So moving on, what's next? The gaps I mentioned, as we mentioned, so we're looking at the literature. We found that most of it focuses on US and Europe. So more research is needed to figure out how to address the most privacy concerns, the most pressing privacy concerns in other geographical settings, also other contexts of use. Finally, so some solutions have been evaluated with user studies of prototypes, while others have been implemented, but more systematic comparison is needed to confirm which recommendations are actually going to be most effective in which conditions. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's this gap between research and industry practice, so we think that more, more consultation between researchers and industry experts would help academic researchers to know which types of interventions are actually the most promising to pursue. So on that note, as we move into the Q&A, I'm of course happy to answer questions to the best of my ability, but I also have questions for you, whether or not you've worked on smart homes. So if you've been waiting for that moment when somebody asks for more a comment than a question, this is it. So namely, based on your experience, which recommendations I've been talking about, which types of recommendations seem more or less likely to make it into practice based on the few words that I said about them? What could researchers do to encourage more industry uptake of research-based recommendations? And also finally, our research team is conducting a study about how smart home product teams deal with these topics. So please contact us if you are willing to be interviewed, or if you know potential people who might be willing to be interviewed that you put us in touch with. So thank you.